بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So this is our second lesson on the 6 principles of Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, Usoolussittah. And in the first lesson we looked at the first principle with the commentary of Shaykh Zayd al-Madkhali rahimahullah ta'ala. And in that lesson the Shaykh basically gave us an introduction to the foundations of Tawheed. He mentioned al-Ikhlas, sincerity to Allah in worship, directing worship to Him alone and being sincere to Him in that worship. He then explained for us the types of actions which clash with this Tawheed, and they fall into 2 categories: that which is the major shirk, which expels a person from Islam, and this is to direct any of the forms of worship to other than Allah. And the second category was the minor shirk, and this is to do actions of worship for other than the sake of Allah. So here we are not directing the actual act of worship to other than Allah. It is being directed to Allah, but within that action, the motive or the intention or the reason isn't sincerely and purely for the sake of Allah alone. It is for some other considerations. So this becomes minor shirk, and it doesn't expel a person from the fold of Islam. However, it is from the greatest of the major sins. And then the Shaykh illustrated that with a number of examples of minor shirk which can take place in terms of the heart, which is ar-riya, which is showing off, or in terms of speech, when a person makes a remark or a statement in which he attributes things which belong only to Allah to other than Allah. Like when he says, for example, whatever Allah wills and what you will. Or when he says, if it hadn't been for the dog, for example, the guard dog, then the robber would have, succeeded. Without mentioning Allah Azza wa Jal, without mentioning if it hadn't been for the decree of Allah, or for, and things of that nature. So the Shaykh explained that really formed a foundation for discussing this particular principle. And so we're going to continue with his explanation briefly with 2 more points. And keep in mind that in this principle, Shaykh al-Islam mentioned how, despite the fact that this issue of Tawheed has been explained clearly in the Quran from so many different angles, in such clear language that even the common person can understand, despite all of this, even the intelligent people, they deviated away from this understanding. So obviously there has to be a reason why this took place historically. And so the Shaykh then explains for us that one of the reasons for this is the spread of ignorance and the things which bring about ignorance. So we'll start our second lesson here today. He mentions what asbabul jahl, the causes of ignorance, is the lack of scholars who nurture the people upon the book and the sunnah. So this is one of the primary reasons why people's understandings are changed and altered and become deviated. That process kicks in because of the absence of the scholars, or the diminishment, the scholars diminish, they decrease in number. The true scholars, that is, either because they pass away or because they are replaced by people who are not genuine scholars. Right? So he says, قِلَّةِ الْعُلَمَاءِ الرَّبَّانِيِّينَ, the lack of scholars that nurture people, the scholars of the book and the sunnah, And instead what we see is two types of people who replace the true, genuine scholars. The first type of people are those who actually, they have knowledge. They do actually have knowledge. However, they are afflicted with deviation. Some sort of deviation enters into their hearts and they swerve away from the truth, not because they don't know it, but because they have personal interests. Maqasid, shakhsiyya. They want to follow personal interests. That could be things like status, could be wealth, could be anything to do from the world. So this type of scholar, he has knowledge, he knows the truth, but because of personal interests, he's not willing to stand up for the truth and to promote the truth and to, invite people to the truth and to admonish the people. And so he has personal interests and he follows them. And as a result of this type of person, therefore, the people, are now in a position where they will not be corrected. And, they will become misguided. And the second type of person is someone who is a jahil. He doesn't have knowledge to begin with, but he pretends to be from the people of knowledge. He pretends to be a scholar. And he pretends to be in the ranks of the scholars. And so then he starts commanding people, prohibiting people, giving verdicts to the people, teaching people, but all of it is upon ignorance and upon misguidance. So this kind of person, he basically harms the people, he does not benefit them, and of course he will bear the burden of this misguidance. And that's because teaching, when a person teaches, it has to be upon the book and the sunnah, the texts of the book and the sunnah, and any person who is not nurtured upon this and puts himself forward, then he will not benefit the people, rather he will harm them. After this point, the Shaykh then goes on to speak a little about the danger of speaking ill of the genuine scholars, the true scholars, and this, in fact, we can count this as a third method or a third reason as to why ignorance appears. Right? The first reason is there are people of knowledge who have knowledge, but they are overtaken by personal interests and they have this inhiraf, they have this deviation in their hearts. Like the Yahud, for example, the Jews, the scholars of the Jews, they knew the truth but didn't abide by the truth, and they inclined to the world and inclined to the worldly interests. Or secondly, it can be someone who is ignorant, does not have knowledge, and he assumes himself to be in the ranks of the scholars and he misguides people like that. Or the third way is when the genuine scholars are reviled and belittled and their position in the eyes of the people is brought down. And this is another way or another method as to how the people turn away from the actual, truthful, genuine scholars who would keep them upon the straight path, upon the right way. And there are many different ways and mechanisms as to how this is done and why this is done. From the ways that they do this, and every party, every group, every sect has their own ways and has their own accusations. So, for example, if you have the modernists or the Mu'tazila, those who put reason ahead of revelation or try to make revelation to agree with reason, they say that the scholars, all they talk about is purification and woman's purity, woman's menstruation, and that's all they know and that's all they talk about, right? And as for the real knowledge, then they don't really understand it, right? This is one of the ways that they use. Or secondly, they might say that the scholars they are stooges of the rulers and they are paid and bought by the rulers. This comes from the Khawarij and people like that. And so every party, every group will have a particular way of belittling and bringing down the scholars, and in reality this is leading people to misguidance. So the Shaykh speaks about that point for a page or so, and then we come to how Shaitan, how he made people to turn to shirk after being upon Tawheed. So in the principle, Shaykh al-Islam said, وَأَظْهَرَ لَهُمُ الشِّرْكِ فِي سُورَةِ مَحَبَّةِ الصَّالِحِينَ وَأَتْبَاعِهِمْ. That Shaitan presented shirk to the people in a beautified way, in the form of loving the righteous people and loving their followers. So the Shaykh says that Shaitan, to many of the people, he presented this shirk with Allah with a concealment or a covering, which is the love of the righteous people and their followers. In other words, he blinded them from seeing something that is shirk and seeing it instead as loving the righteous people and their followers. And this came about because of exaggeration in the righteous people. This is one of the two main causes and reasons behind the shirk in the world. One of them is exaggerating in righteous people. The other one is the exaggerating in the celestial bodies, right? In the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, the phenomena that we see, exaggerating in them and attributing certain powers and forces to them. That was the shirk of the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam. As for this shirk that we are speaking of, this is the shirk of the people of Nuh alayhi salam, and it is exaggeration in the righteous people. And so when people start to exaggerate in righteous people, be they prophets, be they the righteous, then this is the starting point of the path towards shirk. And inshallah, we're going to speak about this in a bit more detail a bit towards the end of the lesson. But at this point, we just want to finish Sheikh Zayd's commentary with this point, which is that, and we see this mentioned clearly in a hadith as well, as the Messenger of Allah, he said, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْغُلُو, beware of exaggeration, فَإِنَّمَا أَهْلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمَ الْغُلُو فِي الصَّالِحِينَ. Indeed, that which destroyed the people who came before you was exaggeration in the righteous people. And this means that even though we ought to respect the righteous people and to show benevolence towards them, we cannot go beyond the specified limit. Once you go beyond that limit, in terms of how much love you show them, how much respect you give them, and what status you put them on, once you go past that limit, and this now is the starting point of shirk with Allah Azza wa Jal. So Shaitan comes at this point, when he makes people pass that line, past that limit, then he leads them in a step by step process until he makes them fall into actual shirk with Allah Azza wa Jal. And inshallah, we look at that process towards the end of the lesson. So anyhow, that's the end of the commentary of Sheikh Zayd rahimahullah. And so what we'll do is move on to the explanation of Sheikh Muhammad Aman rahimahullah. And so he begins, and we'll read through the text of the principle once more, just as a reminder. So the first principle is making the religion sincerely and purely for Allah the Most High alone, without any partners, and explaining its opposite, which is shirk with Allah, and the fact that most of the Quran is in explanation of this foundation from so many different angles that even the common person can understand. Even the most common of the common people can understand. Then, when there occurred upon this ummah whatever there occurred, meaning the spread of ignorance, then Shaitan presented sincerity to Allah in worship and Tawheed, the Tawheed of Allah. He presented that, he covered it with a picture of belittling the righteous people and falling short in fulfilling their rights. And he presented shirk to them, shirk with Allah to them, in the form or the picture of loving the righteous people and their followers. So what the Shaykh says on this, first of all, the first point is that, meaning that in the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal has used such mannerisms or usloob in speech that even the common person can understand. Meaning the language of the Quran is so clear, it's unambiguous, and it's very, very clear that even the common person will be able to understand. However, despite all of this, even the most intelligent people of the world and the most, shrewd people of the world, they erred in this principle, and the reason for that is that they did not study the book and the sunnah. They didn't embark upon studying what the Messenger of Allah came with, and instead they preoccupied themselves with other worldly types of knowledge, or even other Islamic sciences, right? Because many of those people who erred, for example, there are many of the Ash'aris, the scholars of the Ash'aris in the past, who fell into some of these errors, despite the fact that they were skilled in many of the sciences, in fiqh, right? In the sciences of the Quran, in fiqh, in many of the other Islamic sciences. And that's because they did not study the Quran and the Sunnah as it relates to this particular topic. And they became preoccupied in other types, mostly in other types of sciences, whether they are worldly or religious. And some of these sciences could be beneficial, and others amongst them could be harmful when they are, for example, worldly sciences. However, they neglected to study this particular foundation in the Quran and the Sunnah, the foundation of Tawheed. And this indicates that intelligence in and of itself is not sufficient for guidance. There are many, many people who are very shrewd, very clever. In the worldly sense, you see that they have a tremendous amount of intelligence. They have a tremendous amount of achievements. Look at many of the non-Muslims, for example. Look at the tremendous achievements that they have in many, many fields, in industry, in technology, in agriculture, in so many different affairs, in medicine, in biology, biochemistry, everything. And they are very, very shrewd people amongst them. And yet you will see them worshipping a cross, or worshipping an elephant, as you see with these misguided Hindus, right? And they will show enmity on the basis of this fabricated, fallacious religion, which the least amount of intelligence would tell you that this religion is false. So look at how so many of this shows that intelligence, dhaka, shrewdness, this does not equal to guidance. And likewise, you have even many amongst the Muslims, many educated professional people who have professional qualifications, and they think that because of those qualifications, they have a specialism, that therefore they have some right to speak in matters of religion without having actually studied the religion, the foundations of the religion. Many of these people are opinionated and they want to give their opinions. So the point being that intelligence in and of itself is not sufficient. Rather, you have to inherit and take and acquire the inheritance of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the knowledge which he left. And otherwise, as we said before, when this knowledge is not taken from the scholars, the righteous, upright scholars, then this will lead the people to misguidance in a step-by-step fashion. The Shaykh then goes on to say that every single Muslim can claim sincerity to Allah. So every person can claim that I worship Allah, I'm sincere to Allah. However, what it comes down to really is at-tatbiq al-amali, which is the practical implementation, and whether it is in accordance with the guidance of the Messenger of Allah or not. So every person will come and he will say, I'm upon Tawheed. Right? So for example, the Rafidi will say, I'm upon Tawheed. The Shia, he'll say, I'm upon Tawheed. The grave worshipper will say, I'm upon Tawheed. So everyone will make this claim. And just like everybody says, I am upon the Sunnah, I'm upon the way of the Salaf. Everybody can make this claim. And if everybody was left to their claims, and we just took people at face value like this, then truth would no longer remain. There would just be mass confusion. And so this is why the Shaykh says that every person is going to claim that he is sincerely worshipping Allah alone, but what is most important, what is the criterion, is the actual practical implementation and judging it by what Allah and His Messenger revealed. And so this, a person can only be safe from making false claims, like we see the grave worshippers making false claims that we worship Allah alone, yet they contradict it in their actions. A person can only be safe from making these false claims by studying the deen of Allah Azza wa Jal, having knowledge of Allah and having knowledge of His rights, and having knowledge of what is Tawheed, what is the foundation of Tawheed, and what is the completion of Tawheed. And in contrast, what is shirk that invalidates Tawheed, and what is the shirk which makes a person's Tawheed to be imperfect, to be deficient. All of these affairs a Muslim must understand and must study and must know thoroughly, so that when he makes the claim that I am a Muslim, I am upon Tawheed, I am upon the Sunnah, I worship Allah alone, that this is not just a false claim. It's not just something that he says with his mouth, and yet he is contradicting with his actions. As we see many happening among many of the people who are put to trial by way of the graves and the tombs and the saints and so on and so forth. So the Shaykh says that unfortunately it is this field or this knowledge that you see many of the intelligent and shrewd people of the world, that they actually lack this particular knowledge. The Shaykh then goes on to emphasize this point by saying that when we look in the Quran, we find that the entire Quran from its beginning to its end is Tawheed. Because the Quran is either calling to Tawheed, it's either calling you to worship Allah alone, or it is explaining the reward of the one who worships Allah alone. This is what we find in the Quran in a broad general sense. The Quran is either inviting you to worship Allah alone, or it is explaining the reward in this life and the next of the one who worships Allah alone. And in fact, we see that Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he explains this in a bit more detail, because he explains all the types of knowledge in the Quran, and he says there are 5 types of knowledge in the Quran, all of which revolve around the issue of Tawheed. So if you were to take every single verse from the Quran, you would be able to put it into one of 5 categories. So the first category, either Allah Azza wa Jal is speaking about His names, His attributes, or His actions. Either His names or His attributes or His actions. Right? So many of the first category is Allah will mention either His names, His attributes, or His actions. So from His actions, for example, is sending down the rain, reviving the earth, guiding people, misguiding people, giving life, taking life. These are all a mention of Allah Azza wa Jal's actions. Or His names, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, or His attributes, His knowledge, His mercy. So this is one category of verse in the Quran. Or secondly, Allah Azza wa Jal will be inviting you to worship Him alone. Right? He will command you to worship Him alone. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. And they were not commanded except to worship Allah alone. Or we see in Surah Al-Isra, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّهُ. And your Lord has ordained that you do not worship except Him alone. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ اعْبُدُوا رَبَّكُمْ, and so on and so forth. All mankind, worship your Lord. Right? So this is now a clear command to worship Him alone, and to avoid worshipping that which is besides Him. Right? So this is now the second type of verse that we find in the Quran. a command to Tawheed and a prohibition against shirk. The third type is Allah commanding you or prohibiting you in terms of His law. Right? So we'll command you to pray, command you to fast, command you to be righteous to the parents, prohibit you from lying, prohibit you from stealing, prohibit you from shameful deeds, from deeds which are munkar. This now is Allah ordering obedience to Him and His Messenger. In other words, a third type of verse is in relation to law, to the law of Allah Azza wa Jal. And obviously we know that law, adhering to the legislations, that is from the rights of Tawheed. It follows on from Tawheed. The fourth type of knowledge is Allah Azza wa Jal informing the people about what happens to those who worship Him alone and obey Him. In other words, a mention of the stories of the prophets and the messengers and their followers, and how they were aided and supported in this life and rewarded in the hereafter. So in other words, news or information, akhbar, about the people of Tawheed and the rewards for the people of Tawheed. This is the fourth type of verse you will find in the Quran. And hence, all of the stories of the prophets, they enter into, this particular category. And the fifth type of verse you will find in the Quran is information and stories about the people of shirk, ahlul shirk wal kufr, about the people of shirk and disbelief, and what Allah Azza wa Jal did with them in the life of this world. The people of Nuh alayhi salam, the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the people of Musa, the Fir'aun, and the tyrant Fir'aun and his people with him. What Allah Azza wa Jal did to those people, the Aad, the Thamud, and how He abandoned them and punished them, and what will happen to them in the hereafter. Right? So this is the consequence of the people of disbelief and the people of shirk, of polytheism. So every verse in the Quran falls into one of these five categories. And so this is why the whole of the Quran revolves around Tawheed. Every single verse of the Quran is effectively a verse that pertains to Tawheed, when we look at it from this categorization that Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah has mentioned for us. So once that is clear, that the whole Quran is about Tawheed, this makes us understand how the affair of Tawheed is very, very clear in the Quran. And likewise in the Sunnah, there are many, many statements in the Sunnah which have made the affair very, very clear. And unfortunately, the Shaykh says this has been neglected by many of the people who are the muta'allimeen and the muthaqqifeen, people who, they claim to be students or scholars, or they claim to be literate, educated. Unfortunately, they fall into shirk, despite the fact that all of this is very, very, very clear. The Shaykh then goes on to explain the reason for this, why this happened, and it is to turn away from the knowledge or the guidance of the Messenger of Allah, which we discussed earlier. And when this happens, Shaitan comes along and he presents Tawheed to them to be something by which the righteous people are belittled and by which their rights are neglected. So in other words, when a person, when there's a person who worships Allah alone and turns to Him alone in every situation, then Iblis comes along and he makes people to think, look at this person. He's got no concern for the righteous people. He's not turning to the righteous people. He's neglecting their rights. He does not care for them. And he's not attending to them. So in other words, when a person turns his worship only to Allah Azza wa Jal, then Shaitan comes to those ignorant people who've turned away from knowledge, and he makes them think that, in this Tawheed, there's belittlement of the righteous people. there's neglect of the righteous people. And in this manner, people began to have an ugly picture of Tawheed itself. And then from here, he leads them to basically exaggerate in the rights of these people until they give them a right which is greater than the right of Allah to be worshipped alone. And the Shaykh goes on to say, we do not deny that the righteous people have rights. Of course they have rights. And however, from those rights is that we love them for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. But it is not from their rights that we love them alongside Allah Azza wa Jal. So there's a distinction between these two things. There is al-hubb fillah, where you love someone for the sake of Allah, and there is al-hubb ma'allah. You love someone alongside Allah. So now you love them with a type of love that should be only reserved for Allah Azza wa Jal. So we need to be clear about these two different things. So when we love the righteous people who've died, who've passed away, we are loving them for the sake of Allah. And in doing so, there are certain actions we can do for them, such as make dua for them. We make dua for them. And we can do deeds that they can benefit from, whose reward will go to them. Right? There are certain deeds, like Umrah, for example, make dua for them, and things of that nature. All of this is from our love for them, for the sake of Allah. This is very different to loving them alongside Allah, and then on account of this love, giving them the rights that belong only to Allah. Right? And this is what Shaitan makes the ignorant people to fall into when they love these righteous people who've passed away. He makes, he loves them until he makes them a partner with Allah Azza wa Jal in worship. So the Shaykh goes on to say that any person who loves someone alongside Allah, venerates him, and humbles himself to him, shows humility to that person, and exaggerates in venerating him to the level of, to the degree where, for example, he starts believing that this person knows the unseen, or that this person can bring about benefits, or that this person can bring about harms, right? He can accrue benefits or repel harms. When he reaches that level, this has now come to the level of major shirk with Allah Azza wa Jal. And unfortunately, you will see the people flocking to the tombs, to the mausoleums, to the graves, and there will be many people who ascribe to knowledge, even claim to be scholars, who will encourage them upon these actions, validate these actions, make them think that this is correct and acceptable to Allah, and that it does not clash with the kalima la ilaha illallah. There are many evil scholars who will encourage them upon this. So therefore you will see among them are those who will make tawaf around the graves, around the tombs. They will circumambulate like you do around the Kaaba, or they will bring animals and sacrifice them there for this person in the grave to win his favor. And many of the other actions you will ask of them, needs. All of this is the end result of when you start loving someone alongside Allah with the love that is only reserved for Allah. And this is the type of ghulu, or the exaggeration that we see. So, and you will see these people, that any person who criticizes these people and asks them to worship Allah alone, they will accuse this person of belittling the righteous people and of neglecting the rights of the righteous people, because this is how Shaitan how he has basically tricked them. And likewise, in the same vein, the shirk that they ought to have seen, he's concealed it and disguised it with this whole issue of respecting the righteous people, venerating them, caring for them, and he's made them fall into shirk on account of this, deception that he's made them fall into. So that's the essence of what Sheikh Muhammad Aman, rahimahullah, has discussed. And so we'll finish off just by explaining how Iblis in a step-by-step fashion how he uses this issue of ghulu, of exaggeration. So the first point that we should note is that when you see a righteous person, and especially a person who has benefited you in religion, it's very natural for a person to feel indebted, right? To feel in debt and feel that you owe something to a person. This is just very, very natural. Like, for example, when a person is benefited in the worldly sense, someone does him a favor, someone removes him from a hardship, someone benefits him in terms of wealth, naturally you have an affinity, a likeness, a need to be grateful. This is something just perfectly normal, perfectly natural, and it's something like an instinct in a person. And similarly, when a person benefits another in religion, it's even more so, because a benefit in religion is greater than a benefit in the worldly sense. So you'll often find that people become attached to righteous people, scholars, and especially people who became examples of, for example, patience, righteousness, humility, right? People look up to and respect these people, and especially when they are family members and they pass away, all of this is something natural that a person is going to feel. And of course, Iblis, Shaitan, he knows this. He knows human nature. He knows the flaws in human nature, and he knows how to misguide humans, right? He will come to them and take certain emotions and sentiments that they feel, which they deem to be good, and which obviously are good. It's good to love the righteous people. It's good to respect the righteous people. And Iblis is not going to come from the angle of, he wants to come and misguide you from an angle which appears to be good to you, so that you wouldn't think there is misguidance. So what we find then is that there are a series of steps that when a righteous person dies, for example, when the first step is when a righteous person dies, people, the close relatives, they love the deceased person, they want to show respect to the deceased person, and so what they do is, one of the ways is that they will attend to the grave, they will make frequent visits to the grave, they will embellish the grave, they will beautify the grave, they will put flowers on the grave, they will build something on top of the grave, right? Until people even start competing with each other in who can make the grave of their deceased relative to be the most appealing and beautiful. And if you go to any graveyard now, to any Muslim graveyard, you will see all sorts of things. There are lights, there are small fountains people put there, and there are lots of flowers people put there, and the decorations, and all year round they will come, because they think they are honouring their dead. And especially if it's like a righteous person, a knowledgeable person, they feel the need to do that even more, right? And so they think that they are showing a great deal of respect and honour, and that if they do not do these things, they are not honouring the memory of the deceased. Right? This is the first way that Shaitan now comes and starts tricking people, and putting flowers and wreaths and all these kind of things, and renewing the flowers, and this kind of thing. It makes a person attached to the grave and to spend more and more time by the grave. This is one of the ways that Iblis comes and he tricks people into doing these things which oppose the Sunnah. Now, once you start beautifying, that was step number one. Step number two is, once you start beautifying the graves, and this makes you to frequent the graves, and it's not just for giving salam to the dead people, because this is a sunnah to go and to give salam, and also to be reminded of death. These are the two reasons why we visit the graves. It's not for that reason, which is the sunnah, but rather it is for something more. They keep going because they believe that they will go there, they will make dua for the person, and they believe that making dua at the grave is commendable if not better, than making dua at any other place, whether it's at home, whether it's in the mosque, or whether it's in any other situation, right? So a person is now convinced by shaitan somehow that going to the grave and making dua at the grave is something that needs to be repeated and frequented, and then perhaps people will even find certain days of the year or days of the week even. When it's Eid, for example, you see a custom of people going, I have to go to my father's grave, I have to go to my mother's grave because it's Eid, right? And then they will go on Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, and then they'll start adding other days as well. It's Muharram, let's go to the grave, right? So now Iblis deceives people into making these types of visits and making them think somehow that they are obliged to go to the grave and make dua at the grave. At this stage, they are calling only upon Allah, of course. There's no shirk here at all, because shaitan is not going to make you fall into shirk overnight, in a single go. It's in many, many, many stages, and each of these stages could take years. So this is the second stage. Now the third stage, the third step is, now that the people, we find that they are frequenting the graves and they are led to believe that on specific days of the year, right, it's recommended, like, in the month or in the week, to go to the grave and to go to my father's grave, my mother's grave, my child's grave, and to spend some time there, make dua there, right? And they are making dua to Allah. The third step is the person now, instead of saying, oh Allah, making dua to Allah directly, the person now starts asking Allah by way of the status and the position and the honor of the person who is in the grave, right? So in other words, instead of saying, Ya Allah, grant me such and such, oh Allah, grant me such and such, now it is, oh Allah, by the right of this person, or by the status of this righteous person. In other words, he is bringing into his supplication, he's making mention of the fact that this person was righteous, or that this person has a right, or that this person has, some sort of status as a result of which Allah should answer, right? To do this is a bid'ah. It is innovated in Islam to make this type of supplication. Why? Because there is no connection between a person's status and Allah answering your supplication. There's no link between those two things. For example, the Prophet ﷺ has a certain status with Allah Azza wa Jal. But him having that status with Allah has got no connection to my dua being answered. But there's no connection between these two things. Right? In fact, the righteousness of any person, like one of you could be the most righteous person, and if I was to make dua, oh Allah, by the righteousness of so-and-so, I ask you, there's no connection between those two things. So Allah didn't make a connection between another person's righteousness and my dua being answered. There's no connection between these two things. Just like, for example, in the worldly sense, there are some things where there's actually no connection. Absolutely no connection whatsoever. Like if you were hungry and, someone said, go and stand in the garden next to a tree and your hunger will be removed. There's actually no connection between those two things. We know this from experience. There's no connection, right? So in a similar manner, when you invoke Allah and demand Him to answer by the right of another person or by the status of another person, there is no connection between those two things. No such connection has been made in the Quran or the Sunnah, right? When you ask by the haqq, the right, or the jah, which is the honor, or the makan, or the status, there's no connection. This is very different to when you mention a righteous deed, right? So when I say, for example, oh Allah, because of my love for the prophets and the righteous, answer my supplication. This now is correct. Why is this correct? Because in this instance, I am making tawassul to Allah, I'm making nearness to Allah by way of a righteous deed that I have, which is my love for the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This now is a valid method and a valid form of supplication. Why? Because to ask Allah by way of His names or by way of a righteous deed that you did, this is a valid method of having your needs fulfilled. But as for when you say, "Oh Allah, because of the rank of your Prophet, I ask you such and such," then there's no such connection. There's no connection between the Prophet's status with Allah and your dua being answered. There's no connection between those two things. So in other words, what starts happening now is that a person in this third step is frequenting the graves, he's by the grave, and he thinks, you know what, maybe if I ask Allah by way of the status of the righteous people, maybe he'll more likely to answer me. So now he starts making this type of supplication by the grave. And at this point, remember, there is still no shirk at this point. This is still not shirk. But this is something where he's fallen into bid'ah. This is an innovation now, right? To start frequenting the graves on certain days of the year, to make supplication in this manner. All of this now is bid'ah. So after the people have become accustomed upon this for a very, very long while, the fourth step is what Iblis, Shaitan, will make the person think. He will think, you know what? Why don't you just ask this righteous person in the grave, ask him to make dua for you, because his dua is going to be more likely to be answered than your dua. Why is this? It's because, first of all, he's in the barzakh, he's in the grave, he's closer to Allah, and he was a righteous person. He died as a righteous person, and you're just a sinful person. Why don't you ask this person to make dua to Allah for you? This is now where we start entering into the realm of shirk, right? So Shaitan convinces a person that this dua is going to be more beneficial to you than you asking Allah yourself directly. So a person now begins to say, he goes to the grave, so-and-so person in the grave, make dua to Allah. And then after a while, he will start doing this whilst he is away from the grave, at a distance from the grave. And so he'll say, he'll start calling the righteous people, so-and-so, make dua to Allah for me. Right? This is where we've actually fallen into shirk. And this didn't happen overnight. It happened in small, step-by-step, steps over perhaps even generations, perhaps even, decades. This is how this happens. So now, Shaitan, this is step number 4. And now step number 5 is that Shaitan now deceives these people into thinking that so long as they seek help from and venerate the dead righteous people by these acts of devotion, then they will continue to win the intercession with Allah. And that this is the only way that they can get intercession with Allah. If they continue attending to the needs of these dead people, invoking them, right? Venerating them, respecting them, giving them acts of devotion, right? Once this idea has been lodged into their minds, then this is when the grave is taken as an idol that is worshipped alongside Allah. And this is where you see many of these tombs and mausoleums, and where people go to graves and they invoke them and they ask for their needs and so on and so forth, because they've been led to believe that this is how I can get intercession with Allah, and this is how I can have my needs fulfilled. This is how I can have harm repelled from me. This is how I can have benefits come to me, and that my worldly affairs will not be set aright unless I continue to venerate these people. Why? Because they are closer to Allah, they are righteous, they are in the grave, they are in an intermediate stage between the life of this world and the life of the hereafter. Therefore they are closer to Allah, right? All these ways, Shaitan, he tricks the people into thinking that they can therefore call upon these people, ask them for rescue, ask them for benefits, ask them for children, ask them for cures from diseases, ask them for rescue in times of hardship, right? And sacrifice to them, and so on and so forth. So Shaitan now makes them believe that this is the right of the dead people upon them, for them to do these types of things. And that if you do not do these things, you are belittling the rights of these people. You are neglecting them and you are belittling them, right? And so this idea becomes lodged now into the minds of the people. Now, the sixth stage is that Shaitan inspires another group of people to basically create like a mausoleum or a tomb, and to erect structures, and to then create like a permanent residence around that grave, right? Because they know people are visiting, frequenting, and there are some people whom Shaitan inspires where they see that they can make money from this, right? They can make money, they can turn this false religion into money, into trade, into business. So what they do is they convert these places into places of celebration, places of Eid, where people come. Then, stalls are set up, shops are set up, buildings are erected, and it becomes a place where people come. And then Shaitan, makes people to rush to these locations. And so now what you have is a whole system in place which is built around shirk, built upon polytheism, built upon the worship of others besides Allah, built upon grave worship. And this is exactly what you will see in many of the Muslim countries, right? These places have become places of trade, and there are some shrewd, intelligent people who can see that the dumb commoners, the common people, the dumb common people, they are just looking for quick salvation, easy salvation, right? Because they'll believe that if they come, pay some respects to the dead, then their sins and their neglect in Allah's worship will be forgiven, right? So they are looking for cheap and easy salvation. So this is what the common people fall into. So they abandon the religion of Allah. They just, attach themselves to these kind of practices, right? Believing that this is easy, cheap salvation for them. And then there are shrewd, intelligent people who can see that they can make money out of these dumb common people, right? So they will erect an entire system and ask people, we need your money to look after the grave, after the tomb, after this, donate. And they'll start embezzling wealth and funds from the dumb common people, right? And so this now becomes a religious system. This is now, it's completely altered the religion of Allah Azza wa Jal into fake and false religion. And this becomes an enterprise. Right, so now, now what happens is when you come along, or when a prophet or messenger comes along and he invites the people to La ilaha illallah, then the leaders of the people who misguided those people will become the greatest of the enemies to that prophet or that messenger. Because they knew that when this prophet is calling them back to La ilaha illallah, they, the leaders of the people, have the most to lose. Why? Because they have these common people under their sway whom they've misguided with false religion, right? For whatever worldly benefits. That's why the ones who show the greatest enmity to the prophets and messengers are always the leaders of the people. Why? Because they've got people under false religion. And that's the same picture in every place, in every time, in every location. Until even now, in a modern sense, right, the greatest of the enemies to the people who call to La ilaha illallah, who are these people? These are the people who are making, tremendous amounts of wealth by misguiding people, by way of, in whatever forms of methods they're misguiding them, whether it's by entertainment, whether it's by music, whether it's by sport. They've got them in ignorance, complete ignorance. They've got them in materialism, worshipping wealth or seeking wealth. right? And they've got them locked into this, brainwashed them into all of this materialism. And they know that when a person becomes a Muslim, when a woman becomes a Muslim and adheres to modesty, and a person does not drink anymore, does not engage in shameful deeds anymore, does not deal in usury anymore, in riba anymore, does not this. What does that mean? That means there is a loss, right? It means there's a tremendous amount to be lost. And so therefore, the greatest of the enemies of the prophets, are the messengers, are the ones who profit and benefit from false religion. And everyone else, they are just misguided. They're misguided by these people at the top. And so this step-by-step thing that we mentioned here, this obviously is in relation to just one aspect or one route towards shirk, because here we are dealing with exaggeration, al-ghulu, exaggeration of the righteous people. How does shirk arise? Through this route. But obviously there are other routes as well, like we mentioned, the route of astrology and astronomy, the stars, the sun, the moon. This is another avenue towards shirk. And that is the shirk of many types of nations that have gone in history. The Aztecs in the South America, and the Greeks that came before, and many nations, the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the Sabi'a, many nations like that. That's also another thing to investigate and to look at as to how this happens. But this here we are discussing the issue of ghulu, which is exaggeration, and how shaitan, in a step-by-step manner, he misguides people away from tawheed to shirk, and then convinces people that this is the truth to such a degree that they become the greatest of enemies to the Prophet of Allah when he sent, or a messenger of Allah when he sent. This is exactly what happened with Nuh alayhi salam, and with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he was sent to his people. And they believed that they were upon truth. They believed that they were upon, that they were not committing, falsehood and misguidance, right? So this is how all of this happens, and this is the end of our discussion of the first principle